The way in which the story of Christ's resurrection was told changed in those early years of the church writers. Remember, Christ dies around 30 AD. The first person to write about his death and resurrection doesn't write until 30 years later. And in fact, Paul and Peter and Mark were all likely writing about 30 years after the death of Christ. And when they spoke about his resurrection, it did not have that physical or material component to it. They said, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Christ is with us. He will never be taken away from us. Christ is alive and living in relationship with us, and that is the foundation of our faith. But they didn't have the physical, material component. That wasn't added to the resurrection stories until around 90 or even 110 AD, when Matthew and Luke and John were writing. And in order to give more substance to the stories that Mark and Peter and Paul had told, they made the resurrection a more material event. When Paul talks about the resurrection, for example, in Romans 6 and from verse 3 onwards, it's clear that the resurrection is something different than how Matthew, Luke, and John described it. In Romans 6, from verse 3, the Apostle Paul says, "We have died with Christ, and we have been raised up with Christ. His resurrection and his death are alive within us." And you have to examine those words and say, what was Paul saying? We haven't died. We haven't been raised again like Jesus was, but wait a minute, yes we have. If we believe in what Jesus was, then our understanding of God changes. And once we have the understanding of God that was in Christ, the old self dies, and we are resurrected. You see, that's a different resurrection than telling it merely as an historical event. Even in John's Gospel, in John 20, and remember, John is writing quite late, but he still has this original sense of the resurrection when he has Jesus talking to the woman at the well in Samaria. And there Jesus says, "I am the resurrection." Now what does that mean? He shouldn't be saying that. He should be saying one day the resurrection is a thing that will happen to you. But that's not what Jesus says. He says, "I am the resurrection." What I am, that is the new life. And it's a whole different language and a different kind of theology than what comes later on. In Matthew, Luke, and John, the resurrection is told in story form, and we get so hung up on that historical and material and literal aspect of it, we miss the original sense which has real power for our lives today. Let me give you another example of something that has changed and something we need to think about very deeply. And that is the ascension of Christ. 40 days after he was raised from death, and this raised Christ was still appearing to his disciples and others, a problem arose, at least within the minds of the writers telling the story. And the problem is this: you can't have this resurrected Christ walking around appearing to people for the rest of eternity. You have to remove him from the earthly plane. So you have the ascension, in which, as the disciples stand around, Jesus floats up into the sky on a cloud. Now that's a difficulty for us. In the year 2009, we recognized there was no place for Jesus to go up in the sky. Heaven isn't in the sky. God is not in the sky. So what is this story of Jesus being sucked up into the sky? And it's clearly the author's way of speaking in a language that the people could understand, that when they asked the question, where is Jesus? The author would be able to refer to the ascension and say, Jesus has returned to God. But for those people, God was in the sky. And so the only way that Jesus could go back to God was to go up into the sky. But today, we accept the strength of the ascension. Where is Jesus? Jesus is with God. But that doesn't mean he went up into the sky. It's the author's way of saying he returned to God. And in the story of the resurrection, the authors are making the faith proclamation, Jesus was raised again into our world, into the world of our daily lives, our daily struggles, our hopes, our dreams, our morality. Christ is raised and present with us in that world today. And what is Christ in our daily lives? Christ is that deep belief. God is pure love. Each of us is a sinner who needs to be forgiven and who needs therefore to forgive others. Each one of us is precious, and that changes everything about how we live in the midst of the people around us. It is possible to use different language than merely the language of history or material events to describe Christ's resurrection. It's okay to say Christ was raised into the meaning of God. Christ was raised up into the history of the Bible. Christ was raised up into that realm which is permanent and with us and is the godly realm, or Christ is spiritually arisen within all people who believe in him. That is a higher and a different form of language than we normally use. And you might be saying, why am I telling you this? Why am I saying that the resurrection is something different from what we have typically understood? And my answer is this in three parts. Firstly, in mainline theological colleges, such as that of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, theological students have been learning for over 100 years how to think about the resurrection in terms other than historical and material. And yet for 100 years, those graduating students ordained as ministers have withheld those ideas from their congregations. I think we withhold those ideas because we assume that the people we preach to are not intelligent enough to consider them. Or we preach as if the resurrection is only understood historically because it is the easiest thing to do. And of course, the last reason is we are afraid to reveal to people that maybe what we believe is not what they believe. And I don't want to do that. I want you to be able to think about the resurrection in broader, deeper, challenging terms that invite you into a relationship with Jesus Christ. I want you to have some alternative ways to think about the resurrection of Christ. And I want you to be assured that even if you do not think of the resurrection in historical or literal terms, you're still a Christian. At least as much of a Christian as your minister here is.